Hakadosh Boker or Masechet Gittin Daf Ein Aleph Amud Aleph. We're by the two dots, right on the first line on the page. Amar Rav Kahana Amar Rav. Says Rav Kahana in the name of Rav. Cheresh yachol ledaber mitoch haktav. If a deaf mute is able to communicate in writing, kotvim v'notrim get lishto. So they write and they give the get to his wife as he instructed in writing, meaning he's able to write. So let him write. He writes it and then they do it. Amar Rav Yosef, he said, my Kamash is coming to teach you. Tanina, we already learned it once in a Mishnah. Nishtatek, if a man became mute, ve'amru lo nichtov get lishcha. So they tell him, you want us to write a get to his wife? V'irkim miroshon, he nods his head. We're going to check it 3 times. If he says no, no, yes, yes, they're going to give it to him. So therefore, obviously, I'm saying if you could do it, but just by like the gestures, obviously you could do it by writing. You're talking about a mute? Shane ilem, and a mute is different. He says, why? Because a mute man is usually mentally competent, and therefore his agents may write and give it if he gestures to do so. So it was necessary for Rav to add that even a deaf mute could do that, but a deaf mute is worse than a mute. Usually a person that's mute, he's able to hear. So he's actually 100% with it. A deaf mute, they don't know what they've never heard. So it's not the same. So for they don't know, they're not 100% up there. Okay, the Tanyas we learned to write them. The is a cheresh. If he speaks but he doesn't hear, he's deaf. Okay, he's a cheresh. Shomea, if he listens, right? If he hears but he cannot speak, he's an ilem, he's mute. Right? Both of them are considered pichim l'chol divrehem. How do we know that if somebody speaks but he doesn't hear, he's called a cheresh? He says, it's a pasuk. The pasuk said that he's like a cheresh that he doesn't hear, and he's like an ilem, a mute, that he doesn't open up his mouth. If you want, you could say it's not even a pasuk, it's like what people say. Ishtakil milule, speech was taken from him. What does that mean? As ilule, so it's like a ilem, right? It's coming from that word. Ilem, it's like an acronym, right? So there's ilema, is expression. Okay? Amar Bizera says Bizera, if I have a difficulty, this is the difficulty that is going to the Braita. Imlo Yagid, if the Torah says if he does not tell, this comes to exclude a mute as a witness. Why? Because he can't give over his testimony. He's mute. How's he giving over testimony? Amai, why? Hayachol, he could come, right? Amai hayachol lagid mitoch haktav. He could write it down. You're right. He can't speak it over. It says, Im lo yagiv nasavunov. If he doesn't say, so what? We said it's coming to exclude a mute. Why? Because he can't give over testimony. He says, why can't he write it down? So it says, it says, edut kamart, you're talking about edut? Edut, shana edut. Edut is different. The Torah says you have to take from their mouths and not from what they write. You have to remember that when you speak to someone, it's much better than writing. Why do I always tell people about text? Text is the worst thing in the world. You don't know how many times I write a text and you forgot to put a question mark and you were asking a question and thought you were saying a statement. Or the tone of the voice, was a rhetorical question, was it sarcastic? All those things, you could only do it if you hear the tone of voice, if you hear what's going on. If not, they come. I remember I had a conversation with someone, they understood A, it was really B, A, this. You're afterwards, but I never said, what are you talking about? You said it, look, you wrote it down. Completely misunderstood.
That's why voice message is better.
That's why much better. Voice messages. You're saying that's why they did emojis? Yes, but even with the emojis, you have to remember sometimes it's even with the emojis, many times it's not clear. You put a laughing thing, really bad, you wanted to give the guy in the head. You put a laughing thing, Kilu, it's a joke, but really bad, you understand? Like, it's very, very convenient. That's why I tell people. And the people, they don't realize that. So they come to have conversations with their wives, with friends. Speak. You have a mouth.
And after nothing is recorded, but I told you this and I told you that.
Yeah. You understand? And it's a problem. You understand? And then they don't realize, and it's like, what can we do? Fine, next. Meitvei. So he says, they ask a question. Just like they're going to check a mute for Gittin, so too they're going to check him out. They're going to check him out whether it's business transactions, testimonies, and inheritances. But it's written here, testimonies. Meaning here they're going to check him out for a testimony. You just told me that for a testimony he cannot testify. You just said here that you do check him out. So I'm going to say, we're talking about a testimony about a woman's husband. The rabbis were lenient, meaning just like a woman to testify that her husband died, they were lenient. We learned this in Yevamot, if you remember, that they were lenient. That what? That basically they said, you know what? No, let him, let them. So he says, right? So he says such a case, they were going to be lenient, right? In such a case, so he says, "V'aktani Yerushot." It was written by Yerushot, right? Inheritances. Rabbi Yavu says Rabbi Yavu, Yerusha beno bechor. We're talking about inheritance, the mute father's declaration, meaning his firstborn son of the inheritance. Says, yeah, but what about the different businesses and all these things and gifts? My love, we're not talking about the regular. Says no, that he did for himself, his own sales and transactions. Okay, so it's not testifying. There's no testimony here. Matevei. So they're going to ask the following question. What's the question? Cheresh, a deaf mute. They accepted his gestures, his lip movements, and his writing. But only to do with movable objects. Not to do with the Gittin. So you see from here that the Braita is against Rav. Rav wanted to say that a deaf mute is able to communicate by writing. Here you say Mefurash and not for Gittin. So answers the Gemara, you're right. Tanaim. It's a machloka Tanaim. So Tana was learned in a Braita. Yeah, Amar Rashbag says Rabbi Gamliel. When these words if he was originally deaf mute, right? Aval pikach, but if he was competent and then he became deaf mute, who kotev, he could write it. And they actually come and they sign it. Why? Because basically a person that was deaf mute from born, they're not 100% there, because they don't even know how to communicate because they're not. They never heard, so they don't know what it is to speak. They don't know what it is to hear. But a person that always was able to hear, even if he becomes deaf mute afterwards, he's 100% there. You could still he could still. He says, no. Just like when he's going to come and he's going to marry through gesturing, so too when he divorces, is also going to be through gesturing. So it says Gemara, if we're talking about a deaf mute's wife, so then you're right. What are we dealing about? We're talking about a yivama. Okay, yivim man says yivama of who? If you're going to say that it came from the brother, right, of the deaf mute brother, just like he got him in with a remizah, you could get him out with a remizah. So why do we say that you can't get divorced? If he brought him in through hinting, meaning if he got married to her through hinting, he could also divorce her through hinting. No, it came from him through the brother. The brother was a pikach. So if since the yivama fell in front of him through the brother, which was a pikach, it's a completely different halacha. If you want, you could say, really, it was from the cheresh. We made a gzera from the brother, which was a cheresh, because of the brother, which was a pikach. So it says, he also his own wife, the same halacha. Why did the Mishnah permit him to divorce his own wife by gesturing? Why? It should be by writing. It says, you can make a confusion between one yivama and another yivama. But a person will never make a difference, like a mistake between his own wife and a yivama. Meaning by yivamot, they're all the same. They're all yivamot. So a person can make a mistake. But by his own wife, it's completely different than a yivama. So therefore, he won't make a mistake. Do we ever make a decree for a cheresh for a pikach? By a deaf mute because of a pikach? So Ayin Aleph Amud Bet 71b. So he says, right, that now we learned in the Mishnah, if you have two deaf mute brothers that were married to two competent sisters. So again, two brothers that are deaf mute, married to two regular sisters. Or the opposite, two deaf mute sisters, or because one of them was pikacha, one of them was deaf mute, or two of them deaf mute. Or to two brothers which are chereshin, or to two brothers, one of them is pikach, one of them is a cheresh. They're patur from chalitza nibum. But if they were not related, you can sue, they get married to them. If they wanted to divorce them, you'll see, do divorce them. So you see from here that the rabbis never forbade a deaf mute to divorce a yivama that fell from a deaf mute brother. So it says, you're right. Let's go back to the original answer. That according to Rashbag, a man who was originally deaf mute lacks authority only to divorce a yivama. Okay, but he's authorized to divorce a yivama that fell from the brother that was deaf mute. Amar Rabbi Yochanan comes and he says, the friends, they argued on Rashbag. Abai said to we also learned it in Mishnah. Nishtet, if a woman becomes crazy, deranged, lo yotzi, he's not allowed to get divorced her. But if she became deaf, if the husband became deaf mute or deranged, he can never divorce. He can never divorce. Okay? My olamit, what does it mean never get divorced? We're not talking about that he became deaf mute even from writing it down, right? And that means they can't divorce. And if I didn't hear it from Rabbi Yochanan about Rashva Gamimina, Rabbi Shimon refers that he's explaining the reasoning of the Tanakama. What does it mean that he can never divorce her? Even though we see that he's very, very sharp, right? We still don't allow him to divorce his wife. Meaning he became deaf mute and everything. But no, even though he's sharp, he's not 100% up there. He could be sharp in certain things, but he's not. He says a shota, mina Torah, could get divorced, just like a pichit, because it's against her will. So why do we say this is, by the way, brought down on Hechal Maseh. If a woman that's a shota, if she cannot watch over her get, meaning she's 100% a shota, so then she can't get divorced from the Torah. But if she could watch over her get, she could get divorced mina Torah. But we still don't allow her to get divorced, meaning the husband cannot divorce. You know why? Because if she's not 100% there, people will abuse her. They'll start seducing her to have relations with her because she's not 100% there. So it's better that she has to be kept by her husband, even though the husband wants to get rid of her. We don't allow the husband to get rid of her. There's a whole question, will we allow him to get married to another wife, this and that? But technically speaking, we don't allow the husband lechatchila to get rid of her. Why? Because if not, every Joe Schmo is going to come and start, abusing her. You understand? Taking advantage. That's the way it is. Says the Mishnah, Ayin Aleph Amubet, 71b. Amrulo nichtov get lishtecha. Certain people said to a man, shall we write a get for your wife? And he told them, write it. Amrulo sofer v'katav. They told the sofer to write it. And they told the edim to sign it. Even though they wrote it, and they gave it to the man, and he gave it to her. It's batel. He has to tell the sofer, write it, and to the edim, sign it. We saw this already. That means basically it's not just enough that I send a messenger. The messenger, the sofer, has to hear from the mouth of the husband. And the witnesses have to hear from the mouth of the husband. It's not just enough that he comes and he tells a shaliach and that's it. He has to hear. Okay? Very important. Says the Gemara. The reasoning is because he didn't say give it. But if he did say give it, not to him, then you could give it. So it's mashma that because it was only like a half of a shlichut, because he told them to write it and sign it, but then they give it to him to give it to him. So the fact that it was done in such a fashion is not good. But if he went kitvu tru, which means write it and give it, it's mashma that they could write it and give it, and there's no problem. So mani, who is this? So the Amar milim shliach, was words can be given over as a shliach. Sa'ima seifa, let's say the seifa. Until the sofer comes and he tells the sofer, until the husband tells the sofer, write it, and the edim to sign it, that goes according to Rabbi Yosef. The words are not giving over to a shliach. So what's going on? So Reisha Rabbi Meir v'Sev Rabbi Yosef. You're going to tell the Reisha Rabbi Meir and the Sev Rabbi Yosef. Answers the Gemara, yes. In Reisha Rabbi Meir v'Sev Rabbi Yosef. The Reisha Rabbi Meir and the Sev Rabbi Yosef. Abaye comes and he says, "Kula Rabbi Meir here." Really, by the entire thing is Rabbi Meir. The Hachma Iskina, what are we dealing with? He says the lo amar tznu, that they didn't say tznu, give it. If so, it should be until he says give it. What are we dealing with? That he didn't say it in front of 3 people. So it's until he says 3 people. So he says, the entire thing is talking about Rabbi Yosef. What are we dealing with? That he didn't say imru, which means that first of all, there's a difference between having 3 people, because if you have 3 people, it's like they empower them to become like the 3 agents, right? And number 2 also, that he didn't say imru, tell them specifically. So they said, well, until he says imru. Furthermore, does Rabbi Yosef actually even hold of this concept of imru? But now we learned in the Mishnah, katav sofer ve'ed kasher. If right now the writings of the sofer and the signature of the ed is going to be kosher. So says the Gemara, Chatam Sofer Shaninu. We learned that the writing of the scribe is talking about his signature. The Amar of Chassan says of Chassan, Matniti Mani, who is our Mishnah? Rabbi it's Rabbi Yosef that he says, the words cannot be given over to a shaliach.